The Treaty of Amity, Commerce, and Navigation, between His Britannic Majesty and the United States of America, commonly known as the Jay Treaty, and also as Jay's Treaty, the British Treaty, and the Treaty of London of 1794, was a 1795 treaty between the United States and Great Britain that is credited with averting war, resolving issues remaining since the Treaty of Paris of 1783. The terms of the treaty were designed primarily by Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton, strongly supported by the chief negotiator John Jay, and also by President George Washington. The treaty gained the primary American goals, which included the withdrawal of British Army units from pre-revolutionary forts that it had failed to relinquish in the Northwest Territory of the United States. The parties agreed that disputes over wartime debts and the American-Canadian boundary were to be sent to arbitration, one of the first major uses of arbitration in diplomatic history. The Americans were granted limited rights to trade with British possessions in India and colonies in the Caribbean in exchange for some limits on the American export of cotton. The treaty was hotly contested by the Jeffersonians in each state. They feared that closer economic ties with Britain would strengthen Hamilton's Federalist Party, promote aristocracy and undercut republicanism. Washington's announced support proved decisive and the treaty was ratified by a two-thirds majority of the U.S. Senate in November 1794 without a single vote to spare. The treaty became a central issue of contention, leading to the formation of the first-party system, with the Federalists favoring Britain and the Jeffersonian Republicans favoring France. The treaty was for 10 years' duration. Efforts to agree on a replacement treaty failed when Jefferson rejected the Monroe-Pinckney Treaty as tensions escalated towards the War of 1812. The treaty was signed on November 19, 1794. The Senate advised and consented on June 24, 1795. It was ratified by the President and the British government, and it took effect the day ratifications were officially exchanged, February 29, 1796. Issues. From the British perspective, its war with France necessitated improving relations with the United States to prevent the U.S. from falling into the French orbit. From the American viewpoint, the most pressing foreign policy issues were normalizing the trade relations with Britain, the United States as leading trading partner, and resolving issues left over from the Treaty of Paris, which had ended with compromises on every issue but the essential one of independence. As one observer explained, the British government was well disposed to America. They have made their arrangements upon a plan that comprehends the neutrality of the United States, and are anxious that it should be preserved. Nevertheless, the Royal Navy had captured hundreds of neutral American merchant ships in recent months as part of its blockade of revolutionary France, and British officials in Canada were supporting Indian tribes in their resistance to American settlers in the Ohio River Valley, territory which Britain had explicitly ceded to the United States in the Treaty of Paris. Congress voted for a trade embargo against Britain in the spring of 1794, which affected the commerce of the northeastern states in particular. The still infant government under the Constitution was divided between the party of Jefferson and Madison, which favored the French, and the Federalists led by Hamilton, who saw Britain as a natural ally and thus sought to normalize relations with Britain, especially in the area of trade. Hamilton devised a framework for negotiations, and President George Washington sent Chief Justice of the Supreme Court John Jay to London to negotiate a comprehensive treaty. The American government had several outstanding issues. The British were occupying forts on U.S. The British were continuing to impress American sailors into British service. American merchants wanted compensation for 250 merchant ships which the British had confiscated in 1793 and 1794. Southern politicians wanted monetary compensation for slaves who were evacuated by the British Army following the Revolutionary War. Merchants in both America and in the Caribbean wanted the British West Indies to be reopened to American trade. The boundary with Canada was vague in many places, and needed to be more clearly delineated. The British were believed to be aggravating American Indian attacks on settlers in the Northwest. Treaty terms. Both sides achieved many objectives. The British agreed to vacate the western forts by June 1796, and to compensate American ship owners. In return, the United States gave most favored nation trading status to Britain, and acquiesced in British anti-French maritime policies. The United States guaranteed the payment of private pre-war debts owed by Americans to British merchants that could not be collected in U.S. courts. Two joint boundary commissions were set up to establish the boundary line in the Northeast and in the Northwest. Jay, a strong opponent of slavery, dropped the issue of compensation for slaves, which angered Southern slaveholders. Jay was unsuccessful in negotiating an end to the impressment of American sailors into the Royal Navy, which later became a key issue leading to the War of 1812. American Indian Rights Article 3 states, "It is agreed, that it shall at all times be free to His Majesty's subjects, and to the citizens of the United States, and also to the Indians dwelling on either side of the said boundary line, freely to pass and repass, by land or inland navigation into the respective territories and countries of the two parties on the continent of America, and freely carry on trade and commerce with each other." Article 3 of the Jay Treaty declared the right of Indians, as well as of American citizens and Canadian subjects, to trade and travel between the United States and Canada, which was then a territory of Great Britain. Over the years since, the United States has codified this obligation in the provisions of Section 289 of the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952, and as amended in 1965. As a result of the Jay Treaty, native Indians born in Canada are therefore entitled to enter the United States for the purpose of employment, study, retirement, investing, and/or immigration. Article 3 of the Jay Treaty is the basis of most Indian claims, approval and dissent. Washington submitted the treaty to the United States Senate for its consent in June 1795. A two-thirds vote was needed. The treaty was unpopular at first, and gave the Jeffersonians a platform to rally new supporters. As the historian Paul Vogt explains, the Jay Treaty was a reasonable give-and-take compromise of the issues between the two countries. What rendered it so assailable was not the compromise spelled out between the two nations, but the fact that it was not a compromise between the two political parties at home. Embodying the views of the Federalists, the treaty repudiated the foreign policy of the opposing party. The Jeffersonians were opposed to Britain, preferring support for France in the wars raging in Europe, and they argued that the treaty with France from 1778 was still in effect. They considered Britain as the center of aristocracy and the chief threat to the United States as Republican values. They denounced Hamilton and Jay as monarchists who betrayed American values. They organized public protests against Jay and his treaty. One of their rallying cries said, "Damn John Jay. Damn everyone that won't damn John Jay. Damn everyone that won't put lights in his window and sit up all night damning John Jay." Thomas Jefferson and James Madison strongly opposed the treaty. As they favored France, foreign policy became a major dispute between the new Federalist and Democratic Republican parties. It became a core issue of the first-party system. Jefferson and his supporters had a counter-proposal to establish a direct system of commercial hostility with Great Britain, even at the risk of war. The Jeffersonians raised public opinion to fever pitch by accusing the British of promoting Indian atrocities on the frontier. The fierce debates over the treaty in 1794–95, according to one historian, transformed the Republican movement into a Republican Party to fight the treaty. The Jeffersonians established coordination in activity between leaders at the Capitol, and leaders, actives and popular followings in the states, counties and towns. Jay's failure to obtain compensation for lost slaves galvanized the South into opposition. The Federalists fought back and Congress rejected the Jefferson-Madison counter-proposals. Washington threw his great prestige behind the treaty, and Federalists rallied public opinion more effectively than did their opponents. Hamilton convinced President Washington it was the best treaty that could be expected. Washington, who insisted the U.S. must remain neutral in the European wars, signed it, and his prestige carried the day in Congress. The Federalists made a strong, systematic appeal to public opinion, which rallied their own supporters and shifted the debate. Washington and Hamilton outmaneuvered Madison, who was opposition leader. By then out of the government, Hamilton was the dominant figure who helped secure the treaty's approval by the needed two-thirds vote in the Senate. The Senate passed a resolution in June, advising the President to amend the treaty by suspending the 12th Article, which concerned trade between the U.S. and the West Indies. In mid-August, the Senate ratified the treaty 20-10, with the condition that the treaty contained specific language regarding the June 24 resolution. President Washington signed it in late August. The treaty was proclaimed in effect on February 29, 1796, and in a series of close votes. After another bitter fight, the House funded the treaty in April 1796. James Madison, then a member of the House of Representatives, argued that the treaty could not, under constitutional law, take effect without approval of the House, since it regulated commerce and exercised legislative powers granted to Congress. The debate which followed was an early example of originalism, in which Madison, the father of the Constitution, lost. After defeat on the treaty in Congress, the Jeffersonian Republicans lost the 1796 presidential election on the issue. When Jefferson became president in 1801, he did not repudiate the treaty. He kept the Federalist minister, Rufus King, in London to negotiate a successful resolution to outstanding issues regarding cash payments and boundaries. The amity broke down when the treaty expired in 1805. Jefferson rejected a renewal of the Jay Treaty, and the Monroe-Pinckney Treaty of 1806 was negotiated by his diplomats and agreed to by London. Relations turned increasingly hostile as a prelude to the War of 1812. In 1815, the Treaty of Ghent superseded the Jay Treaty. Evaluations. The historians Stanley Elkins and Eric McKittrick note that in conventional diplomatic terms, as of peace of adversary bargaining, Jay got much the worst of the bargain. Such a view has to a great degree persisted ever since. They conclude that although Jay did not succeed in asserting neutral rights, he did obtain his other sine qua nons. He got none of things that were desirable, but not indispensable. They add Jay's record on the symbolic side was open to many objections. However, on the hard side, it was a substantial success, which included the prevention of war with Great Britain. The historian Marshall Smeltzer argues that the treaty effectively postponed war with Britain, or at least postponed it until the United States was strong enough to handle it. Bradford Perkins argued in 1955 that the treaty was the first to establish a special relationship between Britain and the United States, with a second installment under Lord Salisbury. In his view, the treaty worked for 10 years to secure peace between Britain and America. The decade may be characterized as the period of the first rapprochement, as Perkins concludes. For about 10 years there was peace on the frontier, joint recognition of the value of commercial intercourse, and even, by comparison with both preceding and succeeding epochs, a muting of strife over ship seizures and impressment. Two controversies with France pushed the English-speaking powers even more closely together, starting at swords' point in 1794. The Jay Treaty reversed the tensions. Perkins concludes, through a decade of World War and peace, successive governments on both sides of the Atlantic were able to bring about and preserve a cordiality which often approached genuine friendship. Perkins suggests that Jay did fail to win anything the Americans were not obviously entitled to: liberation of territory recognized as theirs since 1782, and compensation for seizures that even Britain admitted were illegal. He also speculates that a more astute negotiator than the Chief Justice would have gotten better terms than he did. He quoted the opinion of the great historian Henry Adams that the treaty was a bad one. No one would venture on its merits to defend it now. There has been no time since 1810 when the United States would not prefer war to peace on such terms. Perkins gave more weight than other historians to valuable concessions regarding trade in India and the concession on the West Indies trade. In addition, Perkins noted that the Royal Navy treated American commerce with relative leniency during the wars, and many impressed seamen were returned to America. As Spain assessed the informal British-American alliance, it softened its previous opposition to the United States' use of the Mississippi River and signed Pinckney's Treaty, which the Americans wanted. When Jefferson took office, he gained renewal of the commercial articles that had greatly benefited American shipping. Elkins and McKittrick find this more positive view open to one big difficulty: it requires that the British negotiated in the same spirit. Unlike Perkins, they find little indication of this, preferring to view the British not as future-oriented, but having had no indication that the United States required attention, wishing to take it off the long list of issues that did. George Herring's 2008 History of U.S. Foreign Policy says that in 1794, the United States and Britain edged toward war, and concludes, the Jay Treaty brought the United States important concessions and served its interests well. Joseph Ellis finds the terms of the treaty one-sided in Britain's favor, but asserts with the consensus of historians that it was a shrewd bargain for the United States. It bet, in effect, on England rather than France as the hegemonic European power of the future, which proved prophetic. It recognized the massive dependence of the American economy on trade with England. In a sense it was a precocious preview of the Monroe Doctrine, for it linked American security and economic development to the British fleet, which provided a protective shield of incalculable value throughout the 19th century.